The old man entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his weathered face a road map of hardship, tilted downwards as if the weight of the world rested upon it. "Name?" barked the court clerk, a young man barely old enough to shave, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A tremor ran through the old man's frail frame as he replied, his voice raspy, like dried leaves skittering across pavement. "Daniel Hayes. Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired." A collective hush fell over the room. Spectators shifted in their seats, a low murmur rippling through the tense atmosphere. No one present, from the board reporters sketching in their notebooks to the grim-faced bailiffs flanking the defendant, could have predicted the extraordinary turn of events that was about to unfold, a secret buried for decades about to explode into the sterile reality of courtroom proceedings. Just minutes ticked by, each one an eternity for Daniel, the cold steel of the cuffs biting into his aged wrists. Judge Sarah Jenkins, a woman known for her sharp intellect and even sharper demeanor, flipped through the thick file detailing Daniel's alleged transgressions, petty offenses that seemed hardly worthy of the somber setting. Suddenly, her gaze locked onto a particular detail. Her breath hitched. The blood seemed to drain from her face, leaving her complexion ashen under the harsh fluorescent lights. That name, Daniel Hayes, it couldn't be. Could it? A ghost from a past she thought long buried, a name whispered in hushed tones in family lore, the man who had single-handedly saved her younger brother's life amidst the brutal chaos of the Battle of Ramadi before vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared, a fleeting guardian angel in a war-torn hell. Respect if you believe honor doesn't fade with age or poverty. His story, about to be revealed, would challenge everything you thought you knew about sacrifice. This was Daniel Hayes, a forgotten hero, now 75 years old, facing charges that threatened to strip him of the last vestiges of dignity. Daniel sat hunched on the hard wooden bench, his shoulders slumped like a ruined monument beneath a threadbare military jacket at least 3 sizes too large, a relic of a life he could barely recognize anymore. The unforgiving courtroom lights, stark and revealing, etched the deep canyons of wrinkles into his face, a testament to years of sun, wind, and untold suffering, a face that once held the proud bearing of a decorated Marine. Decades melted away in his mind's eye. He saw himself standing tall in crisp dress blues, a chest adorned with gleaming medals, a symbol of a nation's gratitude. Now, he was a shadow of that man, clad in clothes donated by a charity, awaiting judgment for acts born not of malice, but of desperation. The bailiff's voice boomed through the silent courtroom, snapping Daniel back to the present. Case number 12B, City vs. Daniel Hayes. Charges: public nuisance, unlawful lodging, resisting a lawful order. Daniel shuffled forward, his movements slow and labored, each step a painful reminder of the shrapnel still lodged in his hip and the arthritis that had twisted his knuckles into gnarled claws. Korea, then Vietnam, 2 tours that had left invisible scars far deeper than the visible ones. Scars that whispered their presence in the dead of night, in the sudden flash of a car headlight, in the smell of rain on hot asphalt. "Mr. Hayes," began the prosecuting attorney, a young man named Brad Sterling, radiating an air of smug confidence in his perfectly tailored suit and meticulously combed hair. He spoke with practiced ease, oblivious to the weight of the man standing before him. "The defendant has been repeatedly warned for sleeping in the alleyway behind O'Malley's Irish pub. The owner has filed 5 complaints in the past 2 months, citing disturbances to his patrons." What Sterling conveniently omitted was the fact that Daniel sought refuge in that specific alley not to cause trouble, but because the warm exhaust vent from the pub's kitchen offered a sliver of respite from the brutal winter nights. He never panhandled, never uttered a word to the pubgoers, existing as a silent, invisible presence in the urban landscape, a ghost seeking warmth in the cold reality of homelessness. Officer Kevin Davies, a burly man with a stern face, took the stand next, recounting the night of the arrest. "I encountered the defendant at approximately 2:17 a.m. He was lying in the alley behind O'Malley's. He appeared to be asleep and refused to vacate the premises when instructed." The truth was, Daniel hadn't outright refused. He had mumbled, half-conscious, asking for just a few more minutes of rest, his body aching with exhaustion and the cold seeping into his bones. He clutched a half-eaten sandwich, A meager offering slipped to him by a kind-hearted dishwasher named Maria, his only meal of the day. But in the sterile light of the courtroom, such nuances were lost. Your Honor, Sterling continued, his voice dripping with professional disdain, the defendant has a history of similar offenses. We recommend a sentence of 60 days in the county detention center and a permanent ban from the downtown business district. This sentence, seemingly minor to the detached legal minds present, represented a death sentence for Daniel. It meant severing his tenuous connection to the only semblance of support he had, the soup kitchen at St. Michael's Mission, the occasional kind word from a stranger, the fragile sense of belonging he found among the other forgotten souls on the streets. It meant utter isolation, a descent into the abyss of despair with no hope of return. Mr. Hayes? Judge Jenkins addressed him directly, her voice betraying none of the internal turmoil she was experiencing. Do you have legal representation? Daniel simply shook his head, his gaze fixed on the worn wooden floor. His court-appointed attorney had called that morning, a hurried message about a conflict of interest, another broken promise in a life filled with them. Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf? She asked, her eyes sharp behind her wire-rimmed glasses, searching for something, anything, in the old man's defeated posture. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. Just trying to stay warm, Your Honor. Didn't mean no harm. Why that particular location, Mr. Hayes? The judge pressed, her voice surprisingly gentle. A flicker of vulnerability crossed Daniel's weathered face. The cook, Liam. He gives me a little something to eat. His father, we served together. Fallujah, a long time ago. A pin could have dropped in the courtroom. Judge Jenkins' hand, resting on the thick legal tome before her, tightened almost imperceptibly. And your military service, Sergeant Hayes? She inquired, the title catching in her throat, the question feeling less like a legal formality and more like a desperate plea for confirmation. United States Marine Corps. 1968 to 1989. Staff Sergeant. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Vietnam. Korea. Desert Storm. The words were a recitation, a litany of battles fought and sacrifices made, a stark contrast to the petty charges he now faced. A wave of dizziness washed over Daniel, the memories flooding back, the heat of battle, the screams, the faces of fallen comrades. For a fleeting moment, the proud Marine he once was resurfaced, a ghost in the shell of the broken man before the court. Judge Jenkins made a meticulous note, her pen scratching against the paper, her mind racing. Something in Daniel's service record, a single line buried deep within the bureaucratic jargon, had snagged her attention like a fishhook. Before she could delve further, the heavy oak courtroom doors creaked open, and a distinguished woman in a power suit that screamed wealth and influence strode in, her presence commanding immediate attention. She approached the defense table with purposeful strides, placed a sleek leather briefcase on the polished surface, and turned to face the court, her gaze unwavering. Your Honor, she announced, her voice clear and confident, cutting through the lingering silence. Eleanor Vance, representing the defendant, Mr. Daniel Hayes. My apologies for the tardiness. I was just retained. Daniel looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Eleanor Vance? He didn't know anyone by that name. He certainly couldn't afford a lawyer of her caliber. A mistake, surely. This is unusual, Judge Jenkins remarked, a hint of surprise in her voice. The court was not informed of any change in representation. A very recent development, Your Honor, Ms. Vance replied smoothly, a hint of a knowing smile playing on her lips. I request a brief recess to confer with my client. Judge Jenkins studied the impeccably dressed attorney, then her gaze drifted back to Daniel, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The court will stand in recess for 20 minutes, she declared, her gavel echoing as she rose and made her way swiftly to her private chambers. Daniel turned to the elegant stranger now seated beside him, his confusion evident. Ma'am, there's been a mistake. I don't have any money for a lawyer. Eleanor Vance leaned in, her voice a low, reassuring whisper. Mr. Hayes, you won't need any. The firm of Vance and Sterling is honored to take your case pro bono. Daniel's eyes widened. Vance and Sterling, that name, it sounded vaguely familiar, a whisper from a forgotten past. Inside her chambers, Judge Sarah Jenkins leaned heavily against her closed door, her composure finally cracking. 20 years on the bench had hardened her, taught her to maintain an ironclad control over her emotions, but the sight of Daniel Hayes, that name echoing the sacrifice she'd carried in her heart for so long, had shaken her to her core. "It can't be," she breathed, her hand trembling as she reached into a locked drawer of her antique desk. Inside lay a faded photograph, the edges softened with time and countless touches. A younger Sarah smiled brightly, her arm linked with that of her brother, Lieutenant Michael Jenkins, resplendent in his Marine Corps uniform, on the day of his commissioning. Beside the cherished photo rested a fragile, yellowed letter, Michael's last communication from the front lines of Ramadi. The ink was slightly smeared, the paper thin from repeated readings. In it, amidst reassurances to his family, he recounted a brutal firefight where his unit had been ambushed. "If it hadn't been for Sergeant Hayes," Michael had written in bold, unwavering script, "I wouldn't be here. He charged through a wall of enemy fire to pull me out after I took a round. He's a true hero." 2 agonizing weeks later, the news arrived. Michael had been killed by a roadside bomb. Sarah remembered the soul-crushing weight of the folded flag presented to her parents, the hollow words of condolence, and the stoic Marine who had approached her afterwards, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "Your brother, he saved my life that day, ma'am," the Marine had choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "He was trying to get to another wounded man when it happened." He didn't need to say more. The unspoken grief connected them in a silent understanding. That Marine's name, etched forever in Sarah's memory, was Daniel Hayes. In the years that followed Michael's death, consumed by grief and a burning desire to know more about her brother's final moments, Sarah had tried to locate Sergeant Hayes. The Marine Corps informed her he had been immediately redeployed and later honorably discharged due to injuries sustained in combat, but his current whereabouts were unknown. He had simply vanished. Now, 2 decades later, he sat in her courtroom, a forgotten hero facing petty charges, his connection to her family history a secret he likely didn't even remember. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her turbulent thoughts. Eleanor Vance entered, her expression a mask of professional concern. "Sarah, are you all right? You looked quite pale." As a former colleague of Sarah's late husband and a close confidant, Eleanor was one of the few who dared to use her first name. "It's him, Eleanor," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion, pointing to the worn photograph on her desk. "The Marine who saved Michael. Daniel Hayes." Eleanor's eyes widened in stunned recognition as the pieces clicked into place. "The homeless veteran in your courtroom, that's him? That's the Sergeant Hayes you've been searching for all these years?" Sarah nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "His service record confirms it. Ramadi, 2003. Same unit as Michael. He was awarded the Silver Star for the very action Michael described in his letter." Does he know who you are?" Eleanor asked softly. "I don't think so. I took my husband's last name after I married James. It's been so long." Her voice trailed off, the weight of the past pressing down on her. "What are you going to do, Sarah?" Eleanor asked gently, her gaze filled with empathy. "You could recuse yourself. No one would blame you." Sarah straightened her shoulders, a newfound resolve hardening her features. "No, Eleanor. I won't let him disappear again. Not this time." "But the ethical implications," Eleanor began, her brow furrowed with concern. "I'm well aware of the ethical considerations," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "But there are also profound ethical considerations about how this nation treats its heroes, the men and women who have given everything, only to be forgotten and discarded." When Judge Jenkins re-entered the courtroom, her judicial robe seemed to hang straighter on her shoulders, her demeanor exuding an aura of quiet authority. Her expression was neutral, carefully composed, yet Eleanor, watching her intently, noticed a subtle but unmistakable steadiness in her gaze, a woman who had made a profound decision. "Ms. Vance," Judge Jenkins began, her voice clear and resonant, "has your client had an opportunity to confer with you?" Eleanor rose smoothly. "He has, Your Honor. At this time, we move to dismiss all charges against Mr. Hayes." Brad Sterling, the young prosecutor, visibly bristled. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant has a clear record of—" Judge Jenkins raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Mr. Sterling, the court has reviewed the defendant's complete file, including his distinguished military service record. Before I rule on this motion, I have a few questions for Mr. Hayes." She turned her attention to Daniel, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Sergeant Hayes, your service record indicates a deployment to Ramadi, Iraq, in 2003. Is that correct?" Daniel, startled by the formality and the mention of his rank, straightened instinctively, years of military discipline momentarily overriding his current weariness. "Yes, Your Honor. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. And on the date of July 14, 2003. Judge Jenkins continued, her voice steady. "Were you involved in a particularly intense engagement in the western sector of the city?" A flicker of recognition sparked in Daniel's eyes, the fog of time and trauma momentarily lifting. Fragmented images flashed through his mind, the deafening roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of smoke and burning metal, the desperate cries of his fellow Marines. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice gaining a touch of its old Marine cadence. "We took heavy fire. Ambush. During that engagement," the judge persisted, her voice imbued with a subtle intensity that went unnoticed by everyone except Eleanor. "Did you, at great personal risk, extract a wounded officer, Lieutenant Michael Jenkins, from a position under heavy enemy fire?" The courtroom fell into an absolute silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. Daniel's brow furrowed, his eyes clouding with the effort of dredging up long-suppressed memories. Lieutenant Jenkins, a good kid. Always looked out for his men. He remembered the young officer going down, the frantic calls for a medic, and the overwhelming urge to get to him, no matter the danger. A lump formed in his throat. "Lieutenant Jenkins," he repeated slowly, the name a ghost on his tongue. "Yes, ma'am. He took a bad hit. I got to him." In the gallery, an older man with a shock of white hair, wearing a faded Marine Corps League cap, leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the bench in front of him. "And what happened to Lieutenant Jenkins, Sergeant Hayes?" Judge Jenkins asked, her voice betraying a hint of emotion. Daniel's gaze drifted downwards, a shadow of pain crossing his weathered face. I got him back to the line. Medevac came. I heard later, he didn't make it." His voice cracked, the unspoken weight of guilt he had carried for years resurfacing with brutal force. Had he been fast enough? Had he done enough? The silver-haired man in the gallery suddenly rose to his feet, his voice trembling with emotion. "He's lying!" he exclaimed, his voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. "Sergeant Hayes didn't just get to him. He single-handedly fought off half a dozen insurgents to reach Lieutenant Jenkins. He saved my life that day, too. I was there." Judge Jenkins banged her gavel sharply, the sound reverberating through the silent room. "Order! Order in the court!" she commanded, her voice regaining its judicial authority, though her eyes held a hint of unshed tears. The courtroom slowly settled, the tension palpable. Daniel looked up, bewildered by the outburst, his gaze meeting that of the white-haired man, a flicker of recognition, Sergeant Major Davies, his old company sergeant major. "Your Honor," Brad Sterling began, his voice laced with indignation. "While we commend Sergeant Hayes' past service, these events are irrelevant to the charges before this court." "I beg to differ, Mr. Sterling," Judge Jenkins interrupted, her voice firm and resolute. "These events, as they are coming to light, have a profound relevance." She set her gavel down with a deliberate thud. "This court will stand in recess for 15 minutes. Bailiff, ensure Sergeant Hayes remains in the courtroom." As she turned to leave the bench, she paused, and in an unprecedented move, looked directly at Daniel, her gaze filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "Sergeant Hayes," she said softly, "when we return, we have much more to discuss. Matters that extend far beyond these misunderstandings." Back in the sanctity of her chambers, the dam of Sarah's carefully constructed composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as the memories, so long suppressed, flooded her consciousness. Michael's laughter, his dreams, his unwavering dedication to the Corps, all extinguished too soon. She clutched the worn photograph to her chest, the pain of her loss as raw as if it had happened yesterday. After several deep, shuddering breaths, she reached for the phone, her hand surprisingly steady. "General Thompson, this is Judge Sarah Jenkins. Yes, it's been many years. I need a favor, a rather unusual one, and I need it immediately." Precisely 15 minutes later, Judge Jenkins re-entered the courtroom, but this time, she was not alone. Behind her, in full dress uniform, walked a stern-faced Marine general, accompanied by a master sergeant and a corporal carrying a highly polished wooden box. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Daniel Hayes rose instinctively, his old training kicking in, his weary body snapping to attention despite the protests of his aching joints. Judge Jenkins took her seat, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces in the courtroom. Then, in another unprecedented act, she removed her glasses and placed them deliberately on the bench. She no longer spoke solely as a judge, but as a woman deeply connected to the man standing before her. "Before we proceed," she began, her voice resonating with emotion, "I must disclose a personal connection to this case. The Lieutenant Michael Jenkins, spoken of by Sergeant Hayes, was my brother." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, heads turning, eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel's eyes widened too, a flicker of dawning recognition mixed with utter confusion. 20 years ago," Judge Jenkins continued, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm, "my brother wrote to our family about a heroic sergeant who had saved his life in Ramadi. A man who had risked his own life, running through intense enemy fire to reach him after he was gravely wounded, and then stayed to provide cover so that other wounded Marines could be evacuated." Her gaze locked onto Daniel's. "That man was Sergeant Daniel Hayes. It's God's honest truth, Your Honor!" Sergeant Major Davies called out from the gallery, his voice thick with emotion. "I was there. Hayes took a bullet himself getting to Lieutenant Jenkins." The corporal stepped forward and stood beside Judge Jenkins. 2 weeks after that incident," she continued, "my brother was killed in action. At his funeral, several Marines who had served with Michael approached my family. They spoke of his bravery, his leadership, but they also spoke of the selfless courage of the sergeant who had saved him weeks earlier. Because of you, Sergeant Hayes, we had 2 more precious weeks with my brother, weeks that we would have never had otherwise." Her voice cracked with unshed tears. She now looked directly at Daniel, her eyes filled with gratitude and a hint of sorrow. "After my brother died, I tried to find you, Sergeant Hayes. The Marine Corps informed me that you had been immediately redeployed. Years later, I was told you had been honorably discharged, but they could not disclose your whereabouts. I never stopped searching." Daniel stood as still as a statue, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions, disbelief, confusion, and a flicker of long-suppressed pride. "And now," Judge Jenkins continued, her voice regaining its strength, "by what I can only describe as a profound act of fate, you stand here before me in this courtroom." She gestured towards the general, who stepped forward, his presence radiating authority. "General Walter Thompson was Lieutenant Jenkins' commanding officer. He has something to add." General Thompson approached the bench, his gaze stern yet respectful as he looked at Daniel. "Sergeant Hayes," he began, his voice booming with military precision, "the United States Marine Corps has been searching for you for many years. Your service record was flagged during a recent review of valorous actions in Iraq. Newly declassified intelligence regarding the Battle of Ramadi has shed light on the full extent of your heroism that day." The corporal stepped forward and opened the polished wooden box he carried. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, gleamed a medal of exquisite design, hanging from a scarlet and gold ribbon. "In the name of the President of the United States," General Thompson announced, his voice ringing with solemnity. And in recognition of extraordinary heroism and action against enemy forces on July 14, 2003, Staff Sergeant Daniel J. Hayes of the United States Marine Corps is hereby awarded the Navy Cross. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded for acts of extraordinary heroism in combat. Newly declassified after-action reports. General Thompson continued, his gaze never leaving Daniel's. Confirm that your selfless actions that day not only saved the life of Lieutenant Jenkins but also prevented the annihilation of his entire platoon by personally neutralizing multiple enemy positions under intense fire. Your Silver Star, while a testament to your bravery, did not fully reflect the magnitude of your actions. Daniel's stoic facade finally crumbled, his eyes welling with tears. This can't be right, he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. I was just doing my duty. There is no mistake, Sergeant, General Thompson affirmed, his voice filled with respect. This honor is long overdue. From the audience, Sergeant Major Davies bellowed. Attention! He snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute to Daniel. One by one, others in the courtroom, those who recognized the gravity of the moment, many former military themselves, rose and saluted Sergeant Hayes, a silent tribute to a hero rediscovered. Even Brad Sterling, the young prosecutor, stood, his earlier smugness replaced by an expression of profound respect. Judge Jenkins, her own eyes glistening with tears, spoke with a voice thick with emotion. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, she declared, bringing down her gavel with a resounding thud, all charges against Staff Sergeant Daniel J. Hayes are hereby dismissed with prejudice. This court stands adjourned. As the courtroom buzzed with stunned whispers and heartfelt congratulations, the Master Sergeant approached Daniel, a tablet in his hands. Sergeant Hayes, we've been trying to reach you regarding an urgent update to your VA benefits. Due to your combat-related injuries and the documented severity of your heroism, your disability rating has been retroactively adjusted to 100% service-connected, effective from your date of discharge. What does that mean? Daniel asked, still reeling from the cascade of unexpected events. It means significant back pay, Sergeant. The Master Sergeant explained gently. Full medical and dental coverage for life, a substantial monthly housing stipend, and access to a wide range of educational and vocational benefits. Eleanor Vance stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Daniel's arm. Our firm will handle all the paperwork, Mr. Hayes. No more bureaucratic nightmares. We'll ensure you receive everything you're entitled to. From the back of the courtroom, Liam, the kind-hearted cook from O'Malley's pub, rushed forward, tears streaming down his face. Sergeant Hayes, he choked out, grabbing Daniel's hand. My father, he served with you in Ramadi. He always said there was a sergeant who saved his life and the lives of half his company. He told me if I ever met a Sergeant Daniel Hayes, I owed him everything. His voice broke with emotion. I never knew, it was you all along. Even Brad Sterling approached Daniel, extending a hand. Sergeant Hayes, he said sincerely, his earlier arrogance completely gone. I had no idea. Please accept my deepest apologies for the way this case was handled. Daniel stood in the center of the room, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within him, shock, gratitude, and a profound sense of relief. The weight of years of being forgotten seemed to lift from his shoulders, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. Judge Jenkins descended from the bench, her judicial facade completely gone, her eyes filled with warmth and genuine emotion as she approached Daniel. Sergeant Hayes, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. My brother wrote in one of his letters about something you said to him as you were pulling him to safety. You said, no Marine gets left behind. Today, Sergeant Hayes, she continued, her voice thick with emotion, we finally make sure that promise is kept for you. 2 weeks later, Daniel Hayes stood before a mirror in a small but clean apartment, a place he still sometimes couldn't believe was his. The Veterans Housing Program, expedited by Judge Jenkins' personal intervention, had placed him in a comfortable one-bedroom unit in a complex specifically designed for formerly homeless veterans. The walls were still bare, but for one proudly displayed item, the newly awarded Navy Cross, mounted in a handsome display case alongside his tarnished Purple Hearts and faded service ribbons, all miraculously recovered by Eleanor Vance from a dusty storage unit he had long since forgotten. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his quiet contemplation. Judge Sarah Jenkins stood in the hallway, no longer in her judicial robes, a small, neatly wrapped box in her hands. "May I come in, Sergeant Hayes?" she asked, a warm smile gracing her lips. Daniel, still getting used to this new reality, stepped aside. "Please, Your Honor. Call me Daniel." "Then you must call me Sarah," she replied, stepping inside. They sat in the small living room, an unspoken understanding bridging the gap between judge and defendant, their shared history a silent presence in the air. "I brought something I thought you might like to see," Sarah said, placing the box on the coffee table and carefully unwrapping it. Inside lay a stack of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. "These are from Michael. He wrote to our family every week he was deployed." She handed Daniel the top letter. This one mentions you specifically. It was written the day after you saved him." Daniel's hands, still bearing the marks of years of hard labor and neglect, trembled slightly as he unfolded the fragile paper. Lieutenant Jenkins' handwriting was neat and precise, just as Daniel remembered from the official reports. "Mom and Dad," he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't worry about what you might be hearing on the news. I'm all right, thanks to one of our NCOs. Staff Sergeant Hayes did something yesterday I still can't quite believe. When our patrol was hit, he moved through a firestorm that would have stopped anyone else. He didn't leave me behind, even when I told him to save himself. He just kept saying, 'No Marine gets left behind.'" Daniel's voice broke, the weight of those long-ago moments washing over him. "He wrote about you often," Sarah said softly, her eyes filled with tears. "He said you were the kind of Marine he always aspired to be. He was a good man," Daniel replied, his voice husky. "Young, but he had heart. Cared about his men. That's rare. After we lost Michael," Sarah said, her gaze sweeping around the small apartment, "I went to law school. All of this, the Veterans Court program I helped establish, the housing initiatives, they all started because of what Michael wrote about you. About how even the bravest heroes can be forgotten by the very system they swore to protect." Daniel looked away, a deep discomfort settling over him at the praise. "I'm not a hero, Sarah. I just did what I had to do." "That's what all the heroes say, Daniel," Sarah responded gently. She hesitated for a moment, then continued, "There's something else you should know. The day he was killed, he was leading a volunteer patrol. They were tracking insurgents who were targeting innocent civilians. He volunteered for that mission. His last letter, he wrote that he was trying to be the kind of officer you were." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow, a sharp, agonizing pain in his chest. For 20 long years, he had carried the silent burden of survivor's guilt, the nagging question of whether saving the young lieutenant had ultimately been in vain. Had his actions that day, amidst the chaos and brutality of war, truly made a difference? "He didn't die because of you, Daniel," Sarah said, her voice filled with conviction, as if reading the unspoken turmoil in his eyes. "He lived the way he did, because of you." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, two souls connected by loss and a shared history of honor, separated by decades but now brought together by an extraordinary twist of fate. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, a silent blanket of white descending upon the city. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "All those years, on the streets, I thought no one remembered. That none of it mattered in the end." "It mattered, Daniel," Sarah assured him, her voice filled with warmth. "It mattered to Michael. It mattered to his men. It mattered to me." As she prepared to leave, Sarah gently placed a hand on Daniel's arm, her touch filled with gratitude. "Michael always said the true measure of a Marine isn't what he does when everyone is watching, but what he does when no one is." You lived that truth, Daniel, even when the world turned its back. Daniel stood a little straighter, a quiet sense of pride returning to his posture, a light rekindling in his eyes after years of darkness. Someone remembered my name, he said simply, a profound sense of peace settling over him. After all this time, someone remembered. In that quiet moment of recognition, something long broken within Daniel Hayes began to heal. Not just for the forgotten hero, but for everyone whose lives he had touched with his selfless courage. Some saved lives on the battlefield, others saved souls from oblivion. Honor needs no grand parades, no thunderous applause. Sometimes, a single moment of genuine recognition, a heartfelt acknowledgement of sacrifice, is enough to help a broken spirit stand tall again. No one should be left behind. Every life has value. Every act of kindness matters. If you believe that too, leave a comment saying, "Remembered," to show your support for our veterans and their sacrifices. And don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Valor for more incredible stories of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit.